Even now, as I sit here, I can't believe I'm about to say this out loud. That same icy feeling crashes over me again, like a wave I can't outrun. How did I let this happen? How did I let it go this far? The truth is, I'm ashamed to even talk about it, but it feels like the only way to finally let go of the ghost that's been haunting me. Before we get into it, though, don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more raw, unfiltered stories like this one. Stick around till the end, and if this resonates with you, hit that like button. It means a lot. You know, it's crazy how your mind can trick you into thinking you're doing the right thing, even when every fiber of your being screams that it's wrong. This was never supposed to happen. What started as a tiny slip, a moment of weakness, snowballed into something I couldn't rein in. Now, I'm stuck with the guilt, the confusion, and this crushing truth I can't escape. I tried to forget it, to shove it all down where it couldn't hurt me, but no matter how hard I tried, the reality of what I'd done kept clawing its way back up. Sitting here now, I see the full extent of the damage. How do you even begin to explain something like this to someone? How do you admit you crossed a line that should have never existed in the first place? I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself, but maybe telling you this, maybe confessing, will be the first step toward facing what I've done. Looking back, I can almost convince myself that everything seemed normal at first. It was one of those calm evenings where life felt predictable, almost comforting. My mom had just finished cooking dinner, and the three of us, my mom, Greg, and I, sat down at the table. There was laughter, easy conversation, and the familiar clink of silverware against plates. For a moment, it felt like we were just a regular family. But if I'm being honest, I knew deep down that wasn't the truth. Even then, I could feel it, this shift in the air between Greg and me. It was subtle at first, something I could brush off as nothing more than a passing thought. But it was there, undeniable in its quiet persistence. I'd catch myself glancing at him, watching how he laughed at my mom's jokes, how his eyes sparkled under the soft glow of the dining room lights. I tried not to stare too long, tried to shake off the weird tingling sensation creeping up my spine, but it wasn't easy. I didn't want to admit that something inside me was changing, that the easy comfort of our family dinners was starting to feel different. What was it? A shift I couldn't explain. Was it just me, or was something shifting in the space between us? Something I wasn't ready to face. The moment my mom walked out the door, I felt it. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I knew something was off. She'd left for another one of her business trips, the kind she'd taken 100 times before. But this time, it felt like she wasn't just leaving the house, she was leaving behind the fragile balance of our family. I stood in the doorway, watching her car disappear down the driveway. The house felt emptier than ever, like a void had settled over everything. And then it was just Greg and me. At first, the space between us felt awkward. We made small talk, the kind of meaningless chatter that happens when two people are alone but don't know what to say. I thought I'd feel relief, like I could finally relax, but instead, the air felt heavy, charged with something unspoken. We talked about dinner plans, how our days had been, but there was this undercurrent, this subtle shift in how we spoke to each other. The distance that had always been there was starting to close, and I didn't know how to feel about it. I noticed the way his hand brushed against mine when we reached for the same mug, how his gaze lingered a second too long when our eyes met. It felt intimate, but in a way that made my heart race. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was nothing, but deep down, I knew something was changing, something that hadn't been there before. And now, with my mom gone, it was just the two of us. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when it all started. At first, everything seemed so innocent, just little moments I could easily dismiss. But now, looking back, I realized those moments weren't as harmless as I thought. They've been replaying in my mind over and over, like a broken record I can't turn off. It began one afternoon when Greg walked into the kitchen like he always did. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, but then he did something that stopped me dead in my tracks. He wasn't wearing a shirt. Time seemed to slow as my eyes traced the muscles in his back, the way the light caught his skin. I wasn't ready for it, and it shook me more than I cared to admit. The moment stretched, filled with a silence that felt heavier than it should have. He didn't seem to notice my hesitation, but I couldn't look away. I should have said something, but I didn't. I just stood there, frozen, feeling this heat rise in my chest as my breath hitched. It was like I'd crossed a line without even realizing it. I told myself it was nothing. After all, it was just Greg, my mom's boyfriend, a guy I'd known for years. But that's the thing, isn't it? It wasn't nothing. Later that evening, as I stirred dinner, the silence in the house felt heavier than ever. The walls seemed to close in, like the space around us was shrinking. I was wearing a light, sheer outfit, something I wouldn't have thought twice about before, but tonight, it felt different. When Greg walked into the kitchen, his eyes met mine, and for a split second, everything stopped. There was this shift in the air, this tension that neither of us acknowledged but both of us felt. It was thick, suffocating, and impossibly uncomfortable. It felt like every emotion, every unspoken thought we'd buried deep inside, had somehow escaped and was now hanging between us, heavy and impossible to ignore. Neither of us knew how to lift the weight of it, and even though we never dared to say a word, the silence was louder than any conversation we could have had. The words we couldn't bring ourselves to speak held a quiet power over us, lingering in the room like a thick fog. It was palpable, pressing, as if the air itself had become charged with something neither of us could name. I wanted to break the silence, to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but I was frozen, terrified of what might happen if I did. What was going on between us? Why couldn't I shake this strange, overwhelming feeling? This wasn't how things were supposed to be. There was no reason for me to feel this way, no explanation for why this moment had become so intense. It was supposed to be a normal day, no different from any other, just walking through the parking lot, lost in my usual thoughts. But in the blink of an eye, everything changed. I was barely paying attention, my mind wandering, when I accidentally bumped into Greg. It wasn't a big deal, just a quick, unintentional collision, but it threw me off balance for a second. The awkwardness hung in the air, and I didn't know how to brush it off. Then, as if the universe was playing some cruel joke, I dropped my keys. They slipped from my hand and skidded across the pavement, coming to a stop just a few feet away. I muttered a curse under my breath and reached for them, but as I bent down, I realized Greg was doing the same thing. Our hands brushed. It was the briefest touch, so fleeting I could have convinced myself it was nothing. But I felt it, a spark that shot through my fingers, a warmth that spread up my arm like an electric current. My breath caught in my throat as I instinctively looked up, meeting his eyes. The glance lasted way longer than it should have. Time seemed to stop, the world falling silent as if everything had paused in that single, shared moment. There was a tension in the air, something undeniable yet impossible to name. It wasn't just a casual brush of hands, it was deeper, something unspoken that neither of us had the courage to address. His gaze lingered on mine, and in that brief connection, I saw something I couldn't quite place. A flicker of emotion that sent a shiver down my spine. It was like an unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of something we both felt but couldn't put into words. We both pulled our hands away quickly, as if the touch had been too much. But the silence that followed was charged, like the air had thickened with something I couldn't explain. I forced a smile, trying to convince myself, and him, that it didn't matter, that it was nothing. But inside, my heart was racing, my mind spinning with questions. Why did that tiny touch feel like it had changed everything? Why did it feel like the air had become electric in a way I couldn't ignore? And more than anything, I couldn't help but wonder if Greg had felt it too, or if I was the only one caught in this strange, overwhelming pull. It was one of those bitterly cold nights where the air felt like it was clawing at your skin, biting into your thoughts as if it wanted to invade your mind and settle there. The power went out without warning, and within seconds, the house was swallowed by an eerie, suffocating silence. At first, I thought the blackout would be nothing more than a minor inconvenience, a quick disruption. But the stillness that followed felt different, heavy, thick, and inescapable, like the night itself had become a living thing. Greg and I found ourselves in the living room, both caught off guard by the sudden quiet. The house, now plunged into darkness, felt both vast and strangely intimate. The absence of the usual sounds, the hum of appliances, the distant whir of the refrigerator, made everything else seem amplified. Every small noise became significant, the soft rustle of fabric as we shifted, the sound of our breaths in the still air. It was like the silence had stripped away all the layers between us, leaving just the two of us exposed and close in the dark. Our hands reached for the same blanket at the same time, our fingers brushing as we both tried to tug it from the couch. A nervous laugh escaped me, and I felt a flicker of embarrassment at how awkward it felt. "Guess we're sharing this," Greg said, his voice low and unexpectedly warm, grounding me in the moment. I nodded but couldn't find my voice to respond. There was no reason to feel anxious, it was just a blanket, just the two of us huddling together against the cold. But when he sat down next to me, pulling the blanket over us, the space between us seemed to shrink in a way that left me unsettled. It wasn't just physical closeness, it was something else, something more intimate that made the air around us feel heavier. We sat there, closer than I'd ever allowed myself to be with anyone before, and yet it didn't feel like a choice. It was as if we had no option but to sit like this, side by side, in the dim glow of a flickering candle. The soft light illuminated his face, casting shadows that seemed to reveal more of him than I was used to seeing. It made him feel closer, like the distance between us had been erased, like nothing could hide what was right in front of me anymore. I looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't look away. His eyes met mine, and in that moment, I knew we weren't just sharing a blanket. We were sharing something deeper, something unspoken, a connection neither of us could deny. The silence stretched between us, long and heavy with words left unsaid. "What do you think about when you're alone like this?" Greg's voice broke the quiet, soft and casual, but there was something underneath it, a depth that caught me off guard. I could tell there was more to his question than he was letting on, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to let him in. But the vulnerability in the air, the way we sat so close in the dark, made it impossible to hold back. The words slipped out before I could stop them. "I think about things I never tell anyone," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Things that are too complicated, too tangled. I think about the future, what it might hold, what could be." The words tumbled out, and once they did, there was no taking them back. Greg was quiet for a moment, processing what I'd said. Then he shifted slightly, his shoulder brushing mine as he leaned a little closer. "What if the future is different than we expect?" he asked, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the stillness of the room. His question hung in the air, making the space between us feel even smaller, like the walls were closing in. I looked at him again, and this time, it wasn't just physical distance that seemed to disappear. It was like we were starting to understand each other on a deeper level, without needing to say another word. The silence between us wasn't awkward, it was full, rich with unspoken meaning. It felt like we were sharing something neither of us was ready to name. In that moment, I realized how much I'd allowed myself to feel. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to stop. The air between us seemed to hold everything I hadn't said, everything I'd kept hidden. And yet, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt like something we could handle, something I could trust. Later, when the night had deepened and the house had settled into an unnatural stillness, the kind that only comes when the rest of the world is asleep and you're left alone with your thoughts, I found myself in the kitchen. I'd been there for what felt like hours, mindlessly cleaning and rearranging things. My hands moved without thought, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. It was always like that when Greg was near. His presence seemed to pull me out of reality, making everything feel sharper, more vivid. But it wasn't the usual chaos of thoughts. It was different, quieter, like a waiting, uncertain tension. I stood frozen in place. I hadn't heard him approach, but suddenly, he was there, standing so close I could feel the heat of his presence. At first, we didn't speak. The silence between us was thick, almost tangible, like it had its own weight pressing down on me. I could feel every small movement, every breath, magnified in the stillness. I couldn't tell if he was waiting for me to speak or if he, too, was unsure how to break the silence. The air between us felt charged with anticipation, growing heavier as seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. With each passing moment, the distance between us seemed to shrink, drawing us closer, yet neither of us moved. The proximity was undeniable, impossible to ignore. I could feel the subtle alignment of our bodies, the space between us so small it might as well have been non-existent. I could sense his presence more keenly than I could see it, and in some ways, that only made it worse. It was like an electric current running between us, a pressure building in my chest that mirrored the rapid thudding of my heart. My pulse raced, and the sound of it seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder with each second. I wanted to step back, to escape the heat of his closeness, to break the tension. But something inside me held me rooted to the spot. I didn't move. And then, without warning, he leaned in. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it, that the tension had played tricks on me. But then his lips were on mine, soft, warm, and undeniably real. Everything around us faded away, the world, the silence, the uncertainty, all of it vanished, leaving nothing but the sensation of the kiss. It was like a moment that had been building for days, weeks, months, an unstoppable force that finally erupted in that one instant. There was no hesitation, no second thoughts. It was pure, unrestrained, and it was everything. It was a release, from the tension, the confusion, and all the feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. Finally, it had nowhere to go but into this one charged moment. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, we pulled back. Neither of us spoke. The silence was suffocating. I couldn't look at him, couldn't even think straight. My heart was racing, my breath shallow. What had we just done? What had I just allowed? Like that, it was over. I stood facing the kitchen sink, and in what felt like a flash, I heard his footsteps. In a split second, he pulled me close, his chest pressing firmly against my back. It felt incredible. I could feel his arousal pressing against me, and in that moment, I turned to face him. Our lips met in the hardest, most passionate kiss I'd ever experienced. We kept kissing, lost in each other, for what felt like forever. I was burning up, every nerve in my body alive with sensation. He guided me to the bed, and in a flash, we were undressing. His clothes came off first, revealing a hairy chest and firm abs. I did the same, baring my body to him. That's when I saw it, what my mom had been enjoying all along. He was the biggest I'd ever seen. My legs spread instinctively as he guided himself in. I held his face, our eyes locked as he entered me. It felt so good. Was this what pleasure was supposed to feel like? He didn't move at first, and I could feel a wave of sensation spreading through my lower body. My toes curled, numb and fragile. I let out a loud scream, unable to suppress it, but he didn't stop. Instead, he went deeper, and I loved every second of it. When it was over, I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like they'd been drained of all strength, and I couldn't even remember when I'd fallen asleep. The next morning, I sat at my desk, the journal lying open in front of me. But the words. I desperately tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. My hands hovered over the pages, trembling ever so slightly, while my mind replayed the events of the previous night. I couldn't escape the weight of it, that unbearable heaviness. The kiss. How it had felt so natural in the moment, yet so profoundly wrong. In those fleeting seconds of confusion, I almost convinced myself it hadn't happened, that I hadn't allowed it to happen. But deep down, I knew the truth, and it gnawed at me relentlessly, like a wound that refused to heal. The guilt was suffocating. I couldn't even look at the journal in front of me because I knew that no matter what I wrote, it would be tainted by the shame clouding every thought in my mind. How could I have let myself fall into this? It wasn't just the kiss, it was everything that had led up to it. The lingering glances, the subtle but undeniable connection, the moments of unspoken understanding that had seemed innocent at the time but now felt like a slow, inevitable unraveling. I hadn't meant for it to happen, but it had, and there was no taking it back. Just then, Greg walked into the room. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, almost like he was trying to ground himself. I looked up at him, my heart hammering in my chest, but I couldn't find the words to speak. He stood there for a long moment, as if gathering the courage to continue, before finally speaking softly, his voice almost fragile. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air, thick with tension, each one heavier than the last. He sat down beside me, and for what felt like an eternity, neither of us said a word. We were both grappling with the enormity of what had happened, unsure how to face the aftermath. Finally, Greg broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what happened last night," he said, "but I know it can't happen again." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle deep in my chest. "I feel the same way," I whispered back, my voice betraying the emotion I couldn't contain. "It shouldn't have happened. It was a mistake." We sat in silence again, the words suspended between us like a fragile thread, threatening to snap at any moment. Neither of us wanted to acknowledge how much everything had changed, but we couldn't pretend it hadn't. "I don't want this to tear us apart," Greg said after a long pause, his voice firm but tinged with emotion. "We have to move on, for the sake of our family." I nodded again, though I wasn't sure if I was nodding to him or to myself. "You're right," I replied, the words heavy and burdened as they left my lips. "We can't let this ruin what we've built. I don't want to lose everything." It wasn't an easy resolution, and I knew the road ahead wouldn't be simple. But in that moment, I understood that we had no choice but to bury it deep within ourselves, to move forward as though nothing had changed, for the family, for the life we'd worked so hard to build. And yet, even as I agreed to try to move on, a part of me couldn't forget. A part of me knew that something had shifted, and no matter how hard we tried to bury it, I wondered how long we could keep it hidden. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Your support, even if it seems like a small gesture, means the world to us and drives us to keep creating content with heart. Don't forget to give this video a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and allows us to keep connecting with you through stories that matter. Thank you for being part of this community.